there's a happening in our day and time, and we figured why not be current to talk about a current event. Um, there's a revival in the land, and I don't know if any of you all used to sing that song, "Lord, send a revival." Albert, did you guys sing that song in your church?
No, we didn't.
Yeah, Lord, send a revival. And the end of the stanza says, and I appreciate this part of the stanza. It was, Lord, send a revival and let it begin in me. So don't just do it out there. I'm not like Michael Jackson, right? I'm starting with the man in the mirror. Let the revival start right here. And but there seems to be a revival in the land. And we titled this Lord Rescind the Revival. Because at some point you get to this point where you start saying, wait, maybe this isn't what we want. um, but anyway, there's a revival in the land. I'm just curious, Al. I sent you this link about a week or so ago. What were your first thoughts when you saw what was going on?
Uh, yeah, it was kind of weird because you sent it to me right in the middle of, like, I was trying to figure a problem out at work, and then you sent that over, and I was like, what? I was like, what? It's like it just felt like a foreign language for
Oh
some
wow.
reason when you sent it to me.
You didn't like think, oh gosh, I'm missing out and hop in your car and
No,
drive to okay.
not
So
not not at all. So, and then when it kind of clicked, and then I was like,
mm,
okay. So I googled it, and then I was like, oh my gosh, and then I just felt. I mean, my
mm,
immediate reaction was like just gross. Just picture that, that emoji that's like about to vomit. Like that was my
really?
initial
You had
reaction.
a
Yeah,
visceral reaction
I had a
to it.
visual reaction.
Why? Because for so many people of faith, they've been praying for this, and it's nauseous. It made you
Uh,
nauseous. Why?
because so I know that, right? I know that this
Mm,
has been something that the evangelical community has been praying for, thinking
mhm,
about, and wanting for so many years. And I remember D.A. Carson,
mm,
talking about this himself. He wanted to see the reemergence of the first evangelical awakening. He was very specific
mm.
about that,
Okay.
right? So those things were very, at one point I identified with that very
Mm,
closely. I,
mm,
was hoping for the best. You read about the influence of George Whitefield and
yeah.
John Newton and
Mhm,
Jonathan Edwards, and then you think about. I mean, it's a very long story that I could kind of tell in terms of my story with it, or
mm,
how I identified with it. But over the years, as I've become,
mm.
not only my deconversion process, but you know, completely having a 180 with my attitudes about, what that means,
Mm,
and how we can understand it, like, as societally, right, and culturally, and
right.
taking a step back and all that stuff. So,
Mm,
yeah, it's visceral because, I don't believe in any legitimacy, obviously, in
okay.
terms of, like, it as a spiritual phenomenon, but
Mm,
I do believe also that there are better ways to explain it away, right? And
okay.
to understand it from a human perspective. So,
Okay, we're gonna talk about some of that tonight.
yeah.
I'm trying to think how I would have interpreted this. I didn't really look into it until today because I knew we were doing this. I just sent you guys a link like, "Hey, this might be of interest." Um, but I wasn't sure because we have two great awakenings, right? In this country, at least, you have the first great awakening in the 1800s, I believe, and then you have the second one in the 20th century. Um, and I think had I still been a Christian, I would have been hoping that this was more of the first great awakening and less of the second great awakening. And we'll talk about what those terms mean. Um, but then when I read about it today, I said, "Oh, so this is kind of like a this almost isn't either of the two. This is a third great awakening, if it's a great awakening or a third awakening that It's not.
Let's not jump
Yeah.
to that
Okay.
conclusion.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. Cool.
exactly.
Cool. All right. Yep. So how about this? Let's start with this. Can you just throw up the first image and you share that, and we'll
Yep.
just say some things about it because we might be looking at proof of divine intervention in our realm. All right. So check this out. On February 5th, right? New York pastor and author Tim Keller wrote an article, or at least it was published. Maybe he wrote it before then, published on February 5th that American Christianity is due for a revival. And he just, he goes through talking about some of the things that he believes puts us in a position where um, we need something to happen to, I guess, awaken people, get people back on board, maybe keep people from jumping overboard. Um, American Christianity is due for a revival. And what do you know? Just 3 days later, a revival breaks out at this school in Kentucky. And so the question becomes, are we looking at divine? Like, is Timothy Keller a prophet? Did he speak in advance this thing? And then unbeknownst to what do you make of that? How
Right.
this man of God said we need a revival, and boom, 3 days later, the nation saw. They're calling this the first revival of the 21st century.
Well, I don't know. So what's interesting is that Keller, I don't consider him to be an evangelical.
Mm,
I don't know if he would be, if he would own up to any kind of spiritual foresight or
mhm,
prophetic, I think I heard him talk about how, like, I terrible at predicting the future
mm,
at one point, but the coincidence or the timing is
mhm.
very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't even make that connection until you just pointed out now. So, what do I think in terms of like what it might say to
Right.
something in terms of I mean, we all understand
Mhm,
how, the Christians have today been voicing a lot of, taking the stance of being the persecuted groups, I guess, in a way.
mhm,
But we are also kind of living in times where, the cultural shifts and then coming out of the pandemic and all that thing,
mhm.
I think there's something to be said, I think, about some sentiment that's
Right.
pervading, the Christian culture. Yeah. So
So then
what do you think? Yeah.
yeah,
What do
even
you
if
think actually?
Timothy Keller, even if he was not prophetic,
Mhm.
you and I don't, adhere to that idea of prophets and all that. But even if he's not prophetic, I guess one thing we could at least say is some contingent of Christianity believed he was right.
Right.
America was in need of something, and something actually happened. And the timing is it's very interesting and fascinating that he would say this, and then 3 days later, this need, because you're right. We just came through the pandemic. We came through a very tumultuous political season, and we haven't even come
Mhm.
through it yet. We're still living in it.
Right.
There's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and China is getting dragged into it. And I mean, there's so much going on. And then the article we're about to get into is going to talk about, even things that are happening beneath the surface. Um, that Timothy Keller doesn't have to be a prophet to say what America is in need of, American Christianity is in need of. I'm sorry, I left out of all that the number of Christians that are deconstructing and deconverting. And so to think we need something, I don't think you have to be clairvoyant to say that.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think even to the point of, understanding like, actually, now that I remember why Keller wrote that article, I didn't get to read it yet, so
Mm,
just for the audience to know, but I think he is in one sense responding to the statistical analysis of, how American Christianity is on decline, and
yeah.
I read a stat that said I think by 2070,
Less than 50% or something like
less than
that.
50%. Yeah,
Yeah.
correct, correct. Would identify as God believing, not necessarily Bible believing, or
Hmm.
but would identify as being a Christian of some form or not.
Hmm.
So yeah, very
Yeah.
timely. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's dig into this article. This is from the New York Times. It's called Woodstock for Christians. Revival draws thousands to Kentucky town.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go paragraph.
Jennifer Palmer told her boss on Thursday morning that she had to leave work and drove 11 hours straight from Jacksonville, Florida to get here. Jaden Peach, a high school student from a few hours away in Kentucky, came to his mother after listening to a speaker at their church. Valor Christian College in Ohio canceled classes, and almost the entire student body drove down in a bus with no plans for where they would spend the night.
Wow.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So this revival breaks out on February 8th. What happens is there's a chapel service, and I went to a Christian college, and they have chapel every day. Some have chapel once a week. It's for spiritual formation.
Hmm.
Um, but at this particular chapel service, once it was over, instead of just going to class, a small group of students stayed and engaged in more singing and prayer. And before you know it, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and the chapel's normally, you know, 10 o'clock in the morning. These guys are there all day praying and singing. And before you know it, students start dragging their mattresses over to the chapel to spend the night there. And this thing just continues. It's just almost like a tarrying service for the old Pentecostals back in the day, where you don't leave. Um, and before you know it, people just start, we're not going to class anymore. We're all going to the chapel. We're still singing. We're still praying. And some people are having spiritual breakthroughs, as it were. I'm no longer going through the things that I was going through. I feel better about life. I feel better. I feel closer to God. I feel like God is present here. This is the place. And then you send out the text messages and other people come and join. And before you know it, the word revival starts floating around. Or some of the students say we don't like the term revival, but rather outpouring. God is pouring out his spirit in this place. And then before you know it, Jennifer is driving 11 hours from Florida
Right.
because, oh my gosh, there's a revival there. I'm going. And this Jaden is, hey, mom, we got it. And kids, other schools are canceling classes and hopping on buses and going to this place where revival is happening. Your thoughts just on that phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, it lines up with well, number one, the observation is that we the viralness, right? That's
Mm,
what Christians today, or what this phenomenon is kind of piggyback on. It's using that same kind of, I don't know what you call it, like a sociological kind of meme, right?
hmm
In a sense, I see it as modern technology kind of
hmm
influencing how certain senses of enthusiasm can kind of spread, and
hmm
kind of drive a certain kind of hype. That's kind of my first kind of reaction to that, and I
Gotcha.
think people being so I mean, it's unprecedented, right? We
Mm,
haven't had anything like this. We haven't seen anything like this yet, and it's you know probably precedent setting for what we might see in
mm.
some sense in the future. So we'll
Well,
see.
think about the old revivals, which we'll get
Hmm.
to in a minute. But the old revivals, you didn't hear about it on social media and go to it.
Right.
There was no social media. There was no, cell
Hmm.
phones. There were no phones.
Right.
uh, the revivals had to travel around. I still remember back when I was a kid, there were tent meetings, and the revival would go from town to
Yeah.
town
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
word didn't spread like that. But now that the
Right.
word spreads, the revival is not necessarily, because we got to talk about that, going from
Mhm.
town to town. You hear about it, and now you go to where the revival is happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. The technology has changed the paradigm a little bit. Hmm.
Yep.
All right,
Yep.
let's keep going.
So for 2 weeks, tens of thousands of people have made a pilgrimage to a tiny Christian college about 30 minutes south of Lexington, from what scholars and worshipers describe as the nation's first spiritual revival of the 21st century, drawn by posts on TikTok and Instagram, plus Old-fashioned word of mouth. There you go.
Mm.
Christians from across the country poured through a chapel on the campus of is it Ashbury or
I think it's
Asbury?
Asbury.
Asbury University to pray and sing until the wee hours of the morning, lining up hours before the doors open and leaving only when volunteers closed the chapel at 1 a.m. to clean it for the next day.
So I was, as I read, I kept waiting to see things that made me say, "Oh boy," like just put my cards on the table. The more charismatic, the more the gifts were involved, the more I was going to be like, okay, so these people are basically just, you know, uh, they're manufacturing miracles to be able to feel like something. But this, I didn't get all the way through it, but I got about maybe 3/4 of the way through it, and I didn't see any of that come up.
Right.
So it began to make me feel like, okay, this isn't the second Great Awakening. This is maybe it's more of the first, but then even that didn't come up as far as
Right.
I read. But we'll talk about that there.
Yep. Yep. Should I keep going?
Yep. Unless you have anything to add, sure.
No, I don't. Um, they were hoping to quote unquote experience the presence of God. Brittany Fauble, a Valor student, said. The unplanned event has strained the campus and kept the little chapel filled at all hours, prompting administrators to wind down the spectacle and disruption. Beginning Friday, the school said there would be no more public events. Students said they were ready to return to their normal campus rhythms.
Hmm.
Nascent revivals are now breaking out of their other colleges, including at Lee University in Tennessee and Cedar University in Ohio, though it remains to be seen if they will sustain the same for Rescind and Asbury.
So that's very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Um, and once again, I'm not going to try to put more on the revivalists than they claim. But if this is an outpouring of the Spirit of God, or if the presence of God, they said students were hoping to experience the presence of God, if that's what's happening and you're a Christian university, Christian school, it's a little odd that you get to the point that you say, okay, this is getting uncomfortable or inconvenient, or we don't have the means to sustain this.
Right.
This is a strain on our staff. So it's almost like presence of God be damned. We got to get back to a sustainable level of
Right.
people here.
Right.
Right. Like think about Jesus,
Yeah.
Jesus had multitudes and, hey, where are we going to get food to feed this many people? I'm
Yeah.
going to do a
Right.
miracle. I'm going to something. I don't know. It's just odd that we got to shut down the revival where people are experiencing the presence of God because of logistics.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think I said earlier, right, Brady.
Mm,
God's limitation is based on the logistics and scale of human capabilities. So always thought that this was ironic, right?
mm,
To think of it in those terms, and it kind of makes me wonder,
mm.
just even like the massive like organizational structures that you need to like think about the Billy Graham Crusades, or
Mm,
think about any other
yeah.
massive like evangelical movement or things like that. It just the amount of money, logistics, and manpower
Hmm.
is just enormous. And
Hmm.
what is that? You know what I mean? Like when you think about Acts, right? The book of Acts, you think
Yeah.
about any other, even the first evangelical awakening, you don't hear about,
Mm.
like the void that is not spoken of is
Well,
like
no,
how
but
those
you know what?
things
In
are
the
being
book of
fulfilled.
Acts, you do hear. So the point that I think you were just getting at is an
Right.
important one. You
Right.
have this organic, and they use the word in the article. You have this organic breaking out, like it wasn't planned, it wasn't organized, it just happened. Students start bringing their mattresses to the chapel, and before you know it, more people start showing up, and then before you know, 50,000 people come to this town. Very organic, but it's hard to sustain organic movements. At some
Right.
point, organic movements need organization, and it becomes an organization. And so when I think about the book of Acts, right, you do have this reporting of outpouring of the Spirit, fervent preaching, tongues, like all the great awakenings, right? The first one and the second one is combined in
Right.
Acts, right? Powerful preaching and miracles and gifts and healings and, tongues and all that. And so it's very organic. But in the book of Acts, at some point, they start saying, yo, we need to choose people to these widows over here are being neglected, these widows over here being taken care of. We need deacons, we need men to, we need organization of this organism. And I don't know, this could just be my skepticism because I can hear the Christian response. My skepticism says, if it's so much the power of God on display, why does it seem like it needs so much human effort to sustain?
Right.
Now, someone could say, well, that's just God making sure that he includes us in the process. So he doesn't do it all for us. But inevitably, what happens is we get involved to organize what happened organically and it fizzles out. You
Well,
start seeing how human it is, and the human fingerprint messes it up.
exactly. So it seems like what you're also saying, what I'm hearing from you, is that the success depends almost wholly on,
Mm,
or at least 90% of it, right, on how well it's managed or how well
mm.
it's implemented.
But it's always unsustainable.
Right.
Like, show me a revival that lasted. That
Right.
was, people came and they sustained it, and it always fizzles out, dies off, or the human element, ruins it. And maybe the Christian says that's because it was just a foretaste. God wanted us to wait for heaven for the whole thing.
Right.
Um, but I don't know. It just makes me say, if the sustaining of it is human, doesn't any part of you wonder, what if its origin was human too?
Right.
What if human need, human desire, human frustration, human longings, what if that created the revival? And then in the course of human affairs, it did what human affairs do. They fall apart. So I don't know. Um, but the administration, they said, hey, after Friday, we got to get back to business as usual.
Yeah.
The students themselves, it said, hey, we're ready to return to class. Like, if I were the Holy Spirit, and maybe this is the sin of blasphemy, I don't know. But if I were the Holy Spirit and the student said, okay, we're ready to get back to class, I'd be like, yo, like, what about me? Like, aren't I better than class? Like, you had enough? I don't know. I don't get that.
I think it's interesting when I hear about some people who have gone into the ministry,
Hmm.
and they may have started out on a really high note, whether it was through speaking engagements and um, I don't know, maybe even writing books here or there, or some people maybe in the Christian hip hop, who knows,
Hmm.
right? Where you kind of start on this kind of high, and then they may go into seminary or they may get into ministry, and then it becomes like kind of this day-to-day grind
Hmm.
that is
Yeah.
not glamorous at all
Yeah.
in the slightest.
Yeah.
And then it's almost like they're disillusioned, I guess. I mean, they never tell us, nobody, but I've heard about
Oh yeah. And being
things
in
like that.
seminary, you hear it, and you
Yeah.
see it. This you become, like you said, disillusioned or just disenchanted
Right.
with the whole thing because you end up seeing just how mundane and just how um, manufactured it all can be.
Right.
Um, yeah, I
So,
don't know. I think that's yeah.
so why can't the spirit overcome that, right? I guess in a way,
Mm,
right? That there's the hypothetical
yeah,
question, right?
yeah.
If the supernatural can, superintendence and supernaturalness
Mm.
can kind of intervene in this. Can they not? Is it a saving out of the mundanity of life?
Right. How about that? How about that? This idea of you have to keep being filled
Right,
with the Holy Spirit,
right.
um, as if it drains, like,
Right,
you were full,
yeah,
and now what do you have? Is the Christian half full or half empty? Like,
yeah,
it's like, I don't know. I'm a glass half full kind of Christian. I'm a glass half empty. Like,
yeah, exactly.
are you the
I
answer
like
to
that.
the is the glass half full or half empty
Right,
is it being filled or is it being emptied?
right.
And that's the question, I guess, for the Christian. Are you being filled or are you being emptied of the Spirit? What's going on?
I like that. That's a great analogy. I never thought of it that
Hmm.
way. If you can posit it in a way where it yeah, it's like is it sometimes I wonder, Brady, is it just that we're not getting enough perspective
Hmm.
on is it just what's driving this thirst for
Hmm.
this kind of enthusiasm and seeing it as a community? I mean,
Yeah.
it's probably not a hard question to answer in a way, but
Well, at
um,
whatever's driving it, the administrators got tired of it, and the
right.
students got tired of it, and they want to. At first, it was Lord send the revival. Now it's Lord rescind the revival.
Person.
But the article is going to get into
Yeah.
what may have been driving the need for this revival. So let's keep going here.
All right. It's like Woodstock, said Nick Hall, 40, an evangelist from Minnesota who arrived last week to witness the kind of spiritual outpouring that he and others have long prayed for. This thing that's happening there is so organic and raw, not flashy, not cool. It's anti-cool. By any definition, a revival is characterized by spontaneous, long-lasting episodes of collective worship, extemporaneous prayer, stirring music, and rousing preaching. The concept has a history stretching back to at least the First Great Awakening in 18th century New England, when crowds of newly fervent Protestants gathered to hear vivid, extemporaneous sermons by pastors like Jonathan Edwards. In the lively tent revivals of the 20th century South, Pentecostals prayed in tongues and said they experienced divine healing, and the notion remains potent for Christians from many traditions and Protestant denominations.
Yeah, we can stop there. The comparison this guy made. He said it's like Woodstock for Christians. So Woodstock was 1969, but 2 years before Woodstock, there was another hippie gathering. Actually, the first hippie gathering was in your home city, Albert, of San
Oh yeah,
Francisco. Yeah, it was called the Summer of Love. You had all these hippies from all over the country come to San Francisco, and sort of like the administrators of Asbury Christian School in Kentucky, when the hippies were coming to San Francisco, the mayor the mayor and the governor told the hippies, "Don't come here. Like, we don't even want it here." But the hippies came anyway. But then this was the after effect. All right, this is the after effect. After the Summer of Love, the Height Ashbury. Oh, look at that. That's funny. Asbury was the name of the town where this
yeah,
revival happened.
yeah,
And this is the
exactly.
Height Ashbury neighborhood where the Summer of Love took place. I
I
didn't even
love it.
think about that.
I love it.
Uh, After the Summer of Love, the Height Ashbury neighborhood that hosted the Free Love festivities was left with massive homelessness, drug problems, and crime. On October 6th, 1967, participants who were sober enough to recognize the gross after effects staged a mock funeral for what they called the death of the hippie. So this is, they had this great summer, everybody came there, but this was the after effect. Now, can you imagine? I have no idea what Asbury looks like in Kentucky after 50,000 people came from all over the country. But what are you doing with 50,000 people once the summer of the spirit, I guess,
Right,
the summer of the love of God, I guess,
right.
once that's over, you have all these people hanging out, and you're like, yo, this is it. Go to the next one, Summer of Love 2. This is the death of the hippie. They staged this big mock funeral. There's nothing in this casket. The casket was symbolic. But she says, we wanted to symbolize, or we wanted to signal this was the end of it. Don't come out, stay where you are, bring the revolution to where you live. Don't come here because it's over and done. And it's funny because in the article that we just read about the Asbury revival, they said, okay, this is it. We're done here. But what happens? It starts kicking off in other cities. Like it's the same thing that happened with the Summer of Love. Like, yo, we trashed this city. Don't come here and do it. Do it in another city now. And so even though everybody came to Kentucky for the revival, Asbury's done. They said, no, take it somewhere else. So the revival does now have to travel because we can't sustain it. We don't have the logistics for that. So now it's happening in Tennessee, and now it's happening in Texas. And it's just interesting to me how this
Yeah.
all works out.
Yeah, logistical nightmare. Absolutely
Mm.
agree. I feel like there's a metaphor here. I can't.
Well, here is a
There's.
metaphor. Here's a metaphor. This is going to play into a episode we're going to do soon. I think it's a metaphor for the church.
Mm,
I think the church is a logistical nightmare. If the Spirit of God really did create this bride of Christ, where Jew and Gentile, the wall is broken down, and there's no male or female, there's no slave or master, everybody's in Christ, everyone's one in Christ. You have this picture perfect body. And maybe at Pentecost, you did have this, the Spirit of God is helping us speak in other languages, and you have this great thing happening. But then you've got 2,000 years of strife, divisions, lack of unity. Like the church is a logistical nightmare. And I think the revival is just a microcosm of the church.
yeah, it's almost like this. It's like this kind of tension constantly between structure and chaos, almost, right?
Mm,
And then we want when there's too much structure in a way, or we get kind of overburdened with it, then there's just this natural tendency
yeah.
to pretend that it doesn't matter, to pretend that
Mm,
it doesn't, so then you have these organic movements that prop up, and then you have people. I mean, they're wanting something.
mhm.
It's, I guess it's a sense of authenticity too, right? They're
Yeah.
they're they're people are looking for authenticity. They're looking for authentic expressions that aren't kind of shackled by um yeah, just the realities of the structures and the foundations that kind of
Mm,
prop us up, and in what makes your life kind of function.
mhm,
And it could be, what it is, it's actually, it's complacency. It's
mm,
really, it's a sense of complacency. I think no matter where, I mean, you could kind of distinguish a little bit in terms of like how the form that it takes today with
mhm,
what we saw in Kentucky might be rooted in anxiety and kind of an uncertainty about the future and et cetera.
mhm.
But um but it's happening in America. It's there's something.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like why don't we in some sense see this in more, maybe it does happen and we just don't
Mm.
know about it, obviously. But there is something unique, I think, about American expressions of
Yeah,
quote unquote
there's the
revivalism. So
need, like you said, there's some need that drives this, and
right.
particularly, I guess, in the American context, there's something that people are looking for, where life becomes dull or
Yeah.
I don't want to say unlivable, but um, I don't know. For some reason, I thought about Genesis for a second there.
Hmm.
You have this chaos at first. You have this unformed, mass, and then the God of Genesis 1 brings
Hmm.
order and function to that which
Yeah.
was unfunctional and formless. Um, maybe the chaos, or the freedom to have the chaos, or to be organic, kind of makes life worth living, but then the function or the structure makes it livable, because you can't remain in that chaotic state, that unformed organic state. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about, I mean, this goes back to it kind of goes back to Greek mythology a bit here, where we're
Mm,
comparing Apollo. Who was he? He was the god of reason, um, versus Dionysus, right? The god of wine You can kind of compare. You can
Mm,
kind of see that's both dichotomy,
interesting.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So what we're kind of seeing here is the god, the god, it's goddess, right? The goddess of wine in action, uh,
Mm,
kind of having that kind of eternal battle
interesting.
against Apollo,
And
and
think about that. How often in scripture is, and even in charismatic circles, is the
mm,
Holy Spirit compared to wine,
oh my
right? Being
gosh,
drunk with the Spirit,
that's right.
filled
Oh
with the
my gosh,
Spirit. Yeah.
I never made that connection. That's amazing.
Interesting. There's
Yes,
something to this idea of, like you said, the
right,
how free I am once I'm in the Spirit. I'm almost like as free as the person that is, you know, inebriated. But I can't live my life that way. At some point, I got to get back to class. Like these students say, at some
right,
point,
yeah,
we got to get back to order. I got to sober up.
right. Oh my
Mm,
god. Oh my gosh, just yeah, and the college student analogy is pretty
mm,
great here. Yeah, it's like
yeah.
amazing.
But how
Yeah.
often, how many times? So let's say, let's just say there was a nationwide revival.
Mm.
How long before the next one? Like, what is it about the nature of things that demands that you're going to need a new revival? And I think you said it. It's the you become complacent, or you become dissatisfied, or you become. Well, I think that's what's coming up next. They talk about why this revival was needed and why it mattered to these students.
Never could I have imagined what we are experiencing now, said Kevin Brown, who has been the university's president since 2019 and spent several very late nights in the chapel. There is a deep hunger born of this trenchant dissatisfaction and disillusionment with what has been handed to the younger generation, and I think they're just raising their gaze to higher things. The campus setting has helped define the revival for many observers as one driven by Generation Z and speaking to their needs. The Ashbury revival is marked by overwhelming peace for a generation marked by anxiety, said Madison Pierce, a student at the unaffiliated Asbury Theological Seminary across the street who volunteered to pray with visitors and help with the logistics. It's marked by joy for a generation marked by suicidal ideation. Interesting. It's
Hmm.
marked by humility for a generation traumatized by the abuse of religious power. Another very interesting
Hmm.
statement. That almost sounds a little woke to me, like quote unquote woke.
Well, this is the New York
Like,
Times, so I
yeah,
wonder. Well, actually, this is a quote from a student.
it's the
Um,
seminary student. Exactly. Yeah.
well, let's talk about those two. Or was it two or
Okay.
three? It's marked bys, or what this is about. It was peace, it
Peace.
was joy,
Hmm.
and something else, wasn't it?
Oof. Peace. And on it's peace and anxiety. Yeah.
Okay. So a generation that's marked by anxiety, this revival is about peace. So the first
Yeah.
great awakening was fueled by fervent preaching. Jonathan Edwards, right? Fervent preaching, people being convicted of their sin. The second great awakening was more about acts of the spirit, right? Um, glossolalia, speaking in tongues, and healings and reports of that kind
Yeah.
of thing. But this awakening is I think it's in here. We haven't read it yet. It's more about the psychological or mental health of this generation.
But if the 20th century revival is focused on healing physical pains and disabilities, accounts of healing at Asbury are overwhelmingly about mental health, trauma, and disillusionment.
Yeah. So yeah, so
Yeah.
this generation is marked by anxiety, is marked by what was it after anxiety?
Yeah, so it's marked by joy for generation, marked by suicidal ideation,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and traumatized by the abuse of religious power.
So stay right there for a second.
Yeah.
It says joy for a generation marked by suicidal ideation. Is that what it says?
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm. So this generation has psychological needs. One of two things. Either God really is, either God exists and really is meeting this generation where they are, um, helping them with their suicidal ideation by giving them this supernatural joy so that they don't have to deal with that anymore. But the question to be asked is, okay, if I follow these students for the next 2 years, how many of them are going to still be faced with their suicidal ideation? Is the joy that they experience over this 2 week period going to linger and keep them from having those contemplations of suicide in 2 months?
We live in an age of information. I mean, we have to think about we the amount of information that humans consume today is nothing like in the
Hmm.
days of Jonathan Edwards.
Hmm.
There's got to be a correlation with right with the invention of like the modern technologies with mobile devices and things like that, and
Mm,
how when they look at statistically, the sharp rises in anxiety and depression.
mm,
There, all I'm trying to
mm,
say is that there is something very powerful psychologically going on with the implications of the environment that we live
mhm,
in. And
mm,
what I'm implying is that I don't know if they can resolve that in any way, uh, just by having,
mm.
you know, a
The
certain kind
spiritual
of,
experience.
yeah, spiritual experience or et cetera. Because I think what's
Or
endemic
if,
in,
or if you
yeah,
can solve it by those means, you're going to need a lot more of those.
right,
You're going to need Asbury's every year or every couple of months.
yeah,
Because, like you said, if one of the triggers, and they have done studies on this,
right,
part of what has driven the suicidal ideation of this generation is how much more self-conscious people have become because of social media and how
right,
much more accessible you are to people's opinions and people's taunts and bullying and all of that because of social media. So if the cure for that is this revival, you're going either this revival is going to need to the effects are going to need to linger for a person's lifetime, or you're going to need more of these to help combat this.
or you're going to have to unplug completely. And
Mm, yeah.
I mean, if you're going to be the hippie, if you're going to be right, if you're going to be the Woodstock,
Mhm.
wouldn't you want to go all the? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Well, how about that? Right?
Yeah,
They
I
were
mean,
their motto was drop out, right?
drop out.
Drop out of
Exactly.
society. And their
Right.
dropout, like you said, there was no phones, no laptops, they
Hmm.
dropped out of just it was too much for them. And maybe
Right.
this speaks to how sensitive people have become over the years. It was too much for them. Let me not say that because I think capitalism does have a way of grinding people down
Right.
till you just feel like shit.
Right.
But it was too much for them then. And so they wanted to drop out of society. This generation, how much more is feeling that I want to just drop out because it's too much.
Yeah.
So maybe you unplug from the things that are making you feel that way, like you said.
Except that where would have this quote unquote revival have happened if it weren't for the
Hmm.
apparatus itself,
Right. Would you
right?
have known that you could drive 11 miles and get to a place that's going to help
Exactly.
you, combat your suicidal ideation or whatever?
Yeah. So there's
Hmm.
there's a locked inness
Hmm.
that is really fundamental to
Hmm.
this phenomenon, and there's this weird feedback loop that's happening. That
Right.
can you break out of it? Can you not?
Hmm.
It's a it feels like a catch 22
Yeah.
for them actually. Yeah.
It feels like a catch 22, and it also feels like it's just a really poor solution to your problem.
Hmm.
Because when I think about, we're all going to go to Kentucky for this revival. Oh, the administration can't handle the logistics of all this, or the students got tired of it, or, whatever's happening made people say, okay, enough. So the people who still need this, or they're doing it in Tennessee now, or now they're doing it in Texas, and you're kind of chasing this revival around the country. It's almost like being in Vegas and a jackpot machine starts paying off. And like, oh, yo, what's happening over there? Oh, that one's done. Oh, they hit over there. Now you got to run to that machine and
Run to that one.
keep
Yeah.
pulling up. Like you got to keep chasing the revival to find out where you're going to get your blessing. It just seems like a poor way to have to live and a
Mhm.
poor solution to your problem. And if the spirit of God is supposedly present with believers everywhere, why do you need to drive 11 hours to
Right.
access it?
Wow. What I'm also kind of making some parallel challenges, or I should say, I feel like
Mm,
what gets a lot of tech companies into trouble, right? We're seeing, um, Google broke certain antitrust laws in Europe, right? So they get
mm,
slapped with billions of dollars, and you have Uber that tried to capitalize and kind of revolutionize the whole driving, service industry, right? And then they ran into trouble.
mm,
It's
mm,
almost like we're kind of seeing the Christian culture is always like, what, how many years behind, right? The
mm,
cusp of like the secular world or whatnot. I'm seeing a little bit about little the analogy there a little bit, because when you introduce a new way of a new medium to the mix, if it's technological in nature, and if it's something that can scale so quickly,
mm,
um, then the problem you run into is that the logistical aspects of the problems that they encountered can't keep up with it. It just
mm.
can't. So there might be a recalibration in some sense that we
Mm.
might see in in
Okay.
in terms of like, this is just a way that, like, they've understood the problem. So
Mhm.
maybe we might see ways in which they might improve some of the logistics
Hmm.
from here on. But it's always like, it turns into a bloody mess at
Mm.
first, right? And we'll
Hmm.
see. But like you said, if is the fervor going to continue, and if it does, and if it's blocked by all of the realities of the real world,
Mm.
um, is that enough? Is it enough to sustain it?
Hmm.
Like, is that even enough to invoke it? I guess maybe that's the
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow. Not just to sustain it, but to
yeah,
invoke it.
to invoke it.
Wow. And
Yeah.
you know what's interesting? I wonder, like, does the fatigue of, and not just the fatigue, but maybe even the futility, if
Mm,
you have this experience and then 2 months later you find yourself back at the well, needing to draw,
right.
another bucket of spirit,
Yeah.
do you at some point start saying, like, what do I like? Why do I need this? Like, maybe this isn't, like you said, is this enough to invoke, not just sustain revival, but
Right.
invoke revival? If I get the sense that I've got to keep doing this, to sustain my well being.
Yeah.
The other part of that was this revival is marked by humility for a generation that is traumatized by, what was it, spiritual abuse, past, was it pastoral abuse or something like that? What did it say?
Yeah. It's the abuse of. I got it right here. The abuse of religious power, traumatized by.
Traumatized by the abuse of religious power. What do you think that could
Yeah.
mean? I'm not even sure necessarily, though I have my
I
ideas.
I mean, are they talking about Ravi Zacharias? Are they talking
Mm,
about? Um, I mean, I have seen a trend.
mhm,
The Pacific Crossroads Church in Los Angeles, who had a pastor who was ousted for, yeah, certain. You would say bullying, things like that.
mhm.
So maybe those kinds of events are happening more frequently now.
Yeah, because
Maybe that's what this
you had
is. Yeah,
the piece they did on Mark Driscoll
Mark Driscoll. That's right.
what was that? What was his name of his
Mars
organization?
Hill. Mars Hill.
Mars
Yeah.
Hill. They did another
Yeah.
piece on, what's the group from New York, um, that does the worship music that everybody likes?
Hillsong.
Hillsong.
Yeah.
There are all these kinds of things that keep coming out about, uh, I guess, the religious powers that be, sort of abusing those
Yeah.
who have given them that position.
Yeah.
So maybe they're referring to that. Um,
Well,
Maybe just the
ties.
dogmatism.
Yeah, dogmatism, but it ties into the structures, right? The
Mhm.
structures that seem to be corrupt and
Hmm.
disillusioned with those structures,
Right.
and yeah,
The
uh,
structures that were put in place to organize
Right.
organic movements, right?
Right. Right.
Mars Hill and
Right.
all of those were organic at
Right.
one point, and then they became organizations.
Yeah.
So now you have this new organic thing that at some point is going to need organization and then become an organ. I don't know. It's a weird way to kind of live your life looking for revivals. But let's be fair. Um, do you think that you in any way have your own version of revivals or rituals that you go to renew yourself when you feel like you're too stuck in the rut?
I'm trying to get better at that.
Mhm,
That's a great question because I think it does speak to I my temperament is probably a little more on the Apollonian side to revive that analogy, right?
mhm,
I am a little more interested and bent towards form, structures, and order a
mhm,
bit more. But the importance of being able to find avenues to cut loose,
mhm,
um, to kind of really get into the moment. Art has been a big way for me. I think. I mean, I have an art background, so
mhm,
that was one way that I've probably been able to express that. But I mean,
mhm.
I don't. I'm not the type that goes. I don't like clubbing. Not that I
Mhm.
would go now, but
Right.
I'm just saying that there are valid expressions, right,
Mhm,
where you're just so caught up in the moment, and
mhm.
you're
Oh,
like,
yeah.
I have to learn that more. That's
Okay.
people who would talk about, they would, I mean, going to some concerts, right? Concerts are
Yeah.
great, like,
Yeah.
especially a band that you love, right? It's like you get
Mhm.
so wrapped up into that, and then it becomes the, you know, the fluid of the bodily whatever you call
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
It's like it's so I used to do that a little more, but I do miss
Mhm.
that aspect of things. Yeah. So I don't
I
know if
wish
that's
we
the way
would have
you were
said this
thinking.
earlier. No,
Yeah.
you just reminded me of something I wanted to point out. The comparison between Woodstock, something like Woodstock, and a church revival. Think about how this revival began, right? Singing and praying
Yeah.
in community and nonstop. They kept it going. Well, what is Woodstock? It's music, it's community,
It's
it's
drugs.
drugs, right? You know what I mean? And all of that creates this sense of
Right.
euphoria,
Right.
this out of bodiness, and not just out of body, but this oneness of everyone that's there, this
Right.
oneness with something that's more grand than yourself. That's what drugs, certain drugs, especially like LSD,
Right.
does. Is it breaks down in your brain the part that helps you separate from what's not you. And so once those distinctions are absolved, you feel like you're at one with everything. Well, what does religion do? Like a lot of times, God is the reason why people feel like they can be one. Even if we can't keep the oneness going, even if the racial divides come back and all that, at least during the service, we have this sense of oneness, and there's music and there's community. And so I think there's something there to be said for, like you said, going to concerts and um, whatever it might be. For me, I'm not sure. I think I like um, lately it's been getting together with family.
Mm.
I know for a long time while I was a believer, I didn't really bang with my family that much because they weren't believers. And even if the ones who were believers, they weren't believers in the way that I was a believer. Some of them were too charismatic. Some of them were too this. They weren't biblical enough. So I didn't even bang with the religious side of my family. But now one of the things that helps me get a sense of renewal is spending time with family and not having any barriers between us. I don't care what you believe. I don't care about your sexual orientation. I don't care. Um, so traveling helps me feel connected
Mhm.
because right now there are parts of the world or parts of the country that just, oh, that's over there, but I can go there and I can get this sense of I'm connected. Um, I don't know. I think I try to find ways to renew, but I also, you talked about what's the need that drives it. What drives this need for a revival. I also try to live my life in ways that don't make me what's the word, I guess. I try to live my life in ways that don't put me at risk of needing revival. So that if I'm
Right.
not draining myself out, talked about the Christian, are you is the Christian half full or half empty? It depends on if you're being filled or if you're being emptied. I try to not become emptied. And so if I don't become emptied, I don't necessarily need this refilling or this revival. Um,
That sounds like paradoxically you have to implement some minimal level of structure so that
yeah,
that doesn't happen.
but there's a balance. You know what I
Right.
mean? So there's structure, but
Mhm.
I don't allow the structure to kill the organic nature of my
Right.
life. You know
Correct.
what I mean?
Correct.
Um, and not everybody, I don't think everybody can necessarily do that because sometimes life just makes it so that it's so structured. I think it helps that I'm single and I don't have kids
Yeah.
and I sort of work for
Very
myself. You know what I
very
mean?
much so. Yeah.
Um, and so I can avoid some of the structure that forces itself upon me. Kids got to be in bed by 8, so it means I got to make dinner by this time, and I got to do. I kind of avoid some of those things. If anybody's listening, like, man, I wish I had your life. It comes with its, there are pluses and minuses to every lifestyle. So it's not the grass is, always seems greener on the other side. But anyway, I try to limit how drained I can become so that I don't necessarily need to drive 11 hours for a revival. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, uh,
Oh my god, you just highlighted the impracticality of the whole thing. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
yeah.
Wow.
But I don't know if you're watching
Yeah.
this, drop a comment. Let us know how did we miss anything? Did we touch on anything that was important? Um, what do you think about revivals? Why are they needed for the Christian? Why does it get to the point where the Christian community needs revivals? What does that say about the nature of it?
Yeah.
Let us know what you think. Any last words on that, Al?
I mean, I think this wrapped up really nicely in a way.
Okay.
But I think so. One last thing I'll say is I'll put a shout out to people who have deconverted,
Mm,
and like we discussed. I'm curious to know how if you've implemented your own revival in your life,
mm,
and what are they, and
mhm,
how does that make you see revivals in a certain perspective, looking
mhm.
back and then looking
Right.
now. So yeah.
And I guess we should probably say too, there was a part of the article, and I don't even remember what it was, so I can't have you read it right now, but where I said, I get it. I get this
Mm,
need for the revival. When they spelled out the need and they talked about how this was helping people deal with, certain issues. On one hand, I get it. And I'm glad that they got to experience that. I just hate to see people living the kind of life where you need something that's so. I mean, this is the first revival of the 21st century. Like, when will the next one be? Uh, to need something that's so few and far between, that just seems so impractical and almost cruel to me.
mm,
And I guess I'm thankful that I don't live that way. That's not to hate on anybody or anything. I couldn't imagine going back to a life where, I was always looking forward as opposed to just be like you said, Al, being in the now.
yeah. And I think for me, being when I became reformed, um, what you just described was something that was felt very strongly. So I think my visceral reaction I had
Hmm.
was stemming from probably that same
Gotcha.
reaction that I would have had even as a
Hmm.
reformed Christian if I were still one now. So
Hmm.
um but
Hmm.
I like what you said, Brady, about the necessity to do it now, to
Hmm.
be, I guess, in some ways present, but also
Hmm. Yeah.
I like what you said about implementing some slight level of structure to make it
Hmm.
happen so that the gas doesn't run out. I think
Yeah.
that's really important. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, good stuff, man. Hey, well,
Yeah.
we'll see you guys in the comments. We'll be checking them out. And Jay will be back next time. But till then, y'all, much love. We out.